Okay, let's get underway. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the HD Week and this session on building skills for and on the job. I'm Hasan Tuluy. I'm the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean. I am not from the HD sector, but I'm an ardent user of the services and the issues that will emerge from this panel discussion. We will sort of discuss in this session some of the approaches for skills development on and for the job market. And I think for many of us, no matter what part of the world we come from, the importance of this thing is quite evident, whether we look at the kinds of issues that we discussed and analyzed in the World Development Report this year, or we look around the globe where we have millions and millions of unemployed youth at the same time that many employers are reporting that they have vacancies they cannot fill because they have skills mismatches and skills shortages. So there really is a systemic issue here, and it has all sorts of social, political, and economic consequences, as I think, for example, of my part of the world, where this is clearly a critical issue. So the questions that the WDR goes back and forth on, skills or jobs first, let's have a discussion on that. It's really a pleasure for me to moderate this session. Let me introduce the distinguished panel, and we will not have presentations here. What I will ask in terms of the order is, after I introduce each of the four panelists, that I will ask them to give a 1 minute, which is a 60-second 1 minute, sort of highlight, not summary, highlight of the particular perspective they bring to this issue. And then we'll have, in 3 segments, a conversation, and I'll, at the end of each segment, try to take 1 or 2 questions from the floor. So let me introduce the distinguished panel. On my right, Ms. Renana Jhabvala, representative of SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. I think one of the wonderful things that I hope she will share with us is how do we deal with these issues in the self-employed and informal sector, which is a big issue in many of our countries. Next to her, Ms. Mourshed. She is the head of the global education practice in McKinsey, and they recently completed a new global study, a very interesting new global study, and she can bring in the perspective of cross-country and cross-continent findings and experiences on education and the workplace and how these two link or do not link together. Next to her, Mr. Karl Rudisser, who is a representative of an association of employers who run a successful on-the-job training and program in North Carolina called Apprenticeship 2000, which is a cooperation between education providers and employers in this particular area. Interesting perspective, shows that perhaps some things can be adapted and exported around the world. And I'd like to thank the Austrian Embassy for the Chamber of Commerce for establishing the contact with Mr. Rudisser. And then next to me, Sergio Urzua. He's currently assistant professor of economics at Maryland. It took him longer to come from the university here than to get into our buildings. Shows how secure we are. And he has researched and reflected on some of the findings of the importance of on-the-job learning, particularly in the Chilean experience, and what is the role of public policy and reforms of public policy and job market training. So let me, as I indicated, turn in order, and maybe we start with you, Sergio. 1 minute, which is the 60-second 1 minute. Give us a what are the main things that your research tells us about the importance of on-the-job training?
Okay.
Versus regular classes.
Okay, sure.
1 minute.
So no problem. So thank you very, very much for inviting me, first of all. So let me just summarize. I think it's fair to say that after reviewing the evidence and working with the data myself, I think it's pretty clear that the correlation between on-the-job training and firm productivity and salaries is positive, and there is a channel from training, on-the-job training on productivity. That's pretty clear from the evidence. The evidence from regular classroom training is ambiguous. I think that's a challenge. It implies a better understanding of what's going on those programs. I think the second main conclusion from the theory is that, from the evidence, is that skills beg skills. So it's very interesting to see how pre-existing levels of skills affect how the effectiveness of those training programs. I think that's a very important thing. And finally, I think having a demand-driven system in which firms are important, a critical player on how training is provided and what sort of training is provided, I think is a very important component that has received some attention, but it has to be developed and fully implemented in the context of developing and developing countries.
Good, thank you. 1 minute. 1 minute, that was excellent. So, Karl, would you share with us what the sort of the highlights of the program that you've put in place in North Carolina? What are the sort of 3 highlighted features that you want to put on?
Good morning, everybody. We, as a metalworking manufacturer, we had problems that we were unable to find people that have hands-on skills that's needed in today's manufacturing industry that's becoming more and more complex and automated equipment. And we needed people that have skills like technicians, mechanics, quality control people, things like that. And they just don't come out of college. So we imported the European dual education system of apprenticeship program and got together, collaborated with about 10 other companies in the region of Charlotte and started this program. Whereas the local community college, they provide 1 day a week the schools, the theoretical in math, physics, English, communication, and the students come from high school. There are students that do not want to go to college, and this gives them a career. Once they finish the 4-year apprenticeship program, they have an associate's degree, and they can have guaranteed a job, and during their work, they are paid as well. And we have this since 1995, and it has been very successful for us. Thank you.
Let me then ask Mona. One of the findings, at least that I took away from the report, which is actually a very accessible report, which I commend you, is that many of the existing on-the-job training events around the world are broken. They don't work. What were the sort of the top 3 reasons as to why these are broken?
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Let me summarize in 3 factoids why things are broken. One is that employers, education providers, and youth literally live in parallel universes. So when you ask about the readiness of youth for the job market, or graduates for the job market, employers and youth will say roughly 50%. Education providers will say about 75%. It's a very different perspective. Second, only 1 in 2 youth say that post-secondary education actually helped them to find a job. 1 in 2. And third is that when you take the employer perspective and you ask to what extent are skills the reason for vacancies, 40% of employers say that skills are the main driver for entry-level vacancies. The problems that these unearth are about data. It's about sector-wide solutions. It's about having training that is actually useful. Just because training is there doesn't mean youth will partake in it. And lastly, having an entity that has a bird's eye view that can understand the very fragmented education to employment system in which we live and can act towards getting towards these solutions.
Thank you. And let me last turn now to Renana. And one of the sort of questions that came to mind is, are workers in a large informal sector particularly disadvantaged with respect to their ability to gain access to on-the-job training? And what is your take and experience on that?
Sure.
Please.
Good morning to everybody. And I would like you to change the pictures in your mind, because when we talk about on-the-job training, it is an employer in a factory or a workplace. Most workers in the developing world are informal. So the pictures in your mind when you're thinking about them should be a small self-employed person, say a farmer working on his farm, or a street vendor she's selling on the street, or a daily wager who comes, say, to a labor place every day and is hired every day as a construction worker, or a woman in her own home who's stitching as an outsourced worker for Gap through a layer of contractors. And when you put those pictures in your mind, then what you're thinking about is a totally different type of training than the kind of on-the-job training we have. Just one more picture, which is what I'm going to be talking about. Many of them are women, and women are also, whether we like it or not, in the developing world, also have to do a lot of housework and care work. So how do you combine the two?
Thank you. Thank you. I think sort of what this shows is the many different perspectives that we have on this panel here. Let's move to the sort of first segment, which is about skills for or on the job. And perhaps we should reflect also in this segment on, are there age or other specific features that we need to take into account? But the difficult question that our WDR had asked was, which comes first, skills or the job? So maybe I'll ask Mona, you sort of try to take a crack at that question. Which comes first, skills or the job, from your experience, from your report?
So this is a bit like asking, is it the chicken or the egg? Essentially, what we would say, you have to work on both in parallel, which I know sounds like the motherhood and apple pie answer, but it is indeed the case. So yes, there are countries like Greece at the moment, or Spain, where there's just a dearth of jobs, and so you need to work on the skills side nonetheless. Because in order for them to become entrepreneurs, in order for them to start their own businesses, just as Renana was just describing, they're going to need a set of skills to do that. Similarly, where there is a plethora of jobs and yet there are simply not enough youth who have the right skills, be it in the world of mechatronics in North Carolina, you nonetheless have to be able to work as well on the job side. So it's a parallel path. It's not possible to make a choice between them, we would argue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of worrisome conversations I often have when I visit the countries is, how do we avoid there being a lost generation because of an economic turndown and slowdown, and the skills of the youth currently unemployed are not going to be useful in the future. So let me ask Sergio, I mean, from the Chilean experience, where you've both studied it and worried about these issues. How does the Chilean experience inform this question of both, which first, and in what order?
So first of all, I think what Mona is indicating is essentially, the main issue here. I mean, this is like sort of the egg versus the chicken. I mean, it's very hard to actually understand what is causing what in this context. Now, having said that, I truly believe that skills, as I said before, skills beg skills. So the idea, Jim Heckman has been putting this idea out there in the context of, early interventions. The same thing probably applies here too. So if you have someone and you want to train this youth, and he's coming from a disadvantaged environment, it's going to be really hard to actually make things work for him. So you want to give him, first of all, the skills and then move forward. So in the context of Chile, we did this, we we work on this paper, and it turns into a book later on. And we did something very interesting. We collect information from, which is similar to what the STEP project is, by the way, here the World Bank is doing. We interview firms and youth they were coming from high school, not even trying tertiary education. We asked firms, what are you looking for when you are interviewing some of these potential employees? So they said, look, it's very simple. This was in the service sector. These are actually an important hotel in Santiago. It was very interesting because the main complaint was these individuals cannot even speak, not English, Spanish. So the slang is so bad, which is actually for us as hotel, international hotel, we cannot even hire them. So what they're doing, actually bringing people from Argentina, Uruguay, that have better skill levels. It was actually even worse. They even mentioned that it was impossible to train. It was so deep, this lack of skills, that for them it was even impossible to have a training system that will alleviate some of these difficulties. So I really think that, when it comes to skills versus jobs, what is first? Probably skills. We have to make sure they have better jobs, right? Because at the end of the day, a good job will reduce poverty, alleviate, improve inequality, and so on. But I think when it comes to understanding how to improve the labor market conditions of disadvantage, probably you want to invest in overall and general, comprehensive, potentially very expensive training programs that provide basic skills.
A couple of sort of nuggets that maybe I'll pass on to Karl to think about. One, you said some employers in Chile thought it was impossible to remediate and train and to bring in workers from neighboring countries. And you also said that skills beget skills. So let me ask the question to Karl and your reflections on, in your line of business.
Well, I would say,
are workers trainable? To what extent? And are there certain skills that are a minimum before you can even get to that stage where you can build on with further training?
Yes, I would say your workers are trainable. And my understanding is that in the United States, the minimum education, the high school diploma, is a must for us, and I think that works well in the U.S. That, my opinion, most people have a high school diploma, and so they have the minimum requirement. And how we transition them to the workplace is that in the 12th grade of high school, they are in school in the morning, and in the afternoon they work in our company. They get paid for that, for the 4 hours. So they slowly transition into apprenticeship program, and the second year they are a full-time employee. So the skills that we need is really math, physics, communication, English, and yes, they're to some extent lacking, but they continue their education. So I would have to say for us, a high school diploma is sufficient as a basic education.
As a way then for you to be able to have employer purpose-built training to further increase those skills that you particularly need.
Yes, that we can naturally continue on mainly on the communication skills for the young people. They are typically 18 years old, and that's, in my opinion, what's missing most. And they have to continue that. And if they don't have it, they have to go to evening school. So we're very strict on education, continuing education, not only on the job training.
Mm-hmm. What you bring is a very structured formal sector.
Yes, it's
formal industry, and perhaps one of the questions that I would then ask Renana is to sort of think and reflect on how does this play out in the informal sector, where the scale and size of the industry, the industry in a broad sense may be much smaller, and what kinds of skills do your members want and seek?
I think I actually will go back to your original question, skills or jobs. And I think for the informal economy, it's a very clear answer. It's the jobs. And job in the sense of work, not necessarily an employer-employee relationship. Because they enter the job market, the labor market fairly early. And one way of I think, we have to look at the difference between learning and training, because once they start working, they do learn. They learn because they're those who are more intelligent learn better, those who are less learn less. But the external training is very less. I'm now talking about India. I think the last figure I saw was only 5% of workers had any formal training, only 5%. However, there is a lot of informal training, and that comes either through the family, or in India we have this, what you will call apprenticeship, where an older person is teaching a younger person. So say you have a family farm or you have a small family business, the children start working early, even if they're going to school. So there is a lot of informal training, not formal training. And what do they need really is, what they need is, if they have, say, let me just take the small business. They are often looking for higher technologies, better productivity. How do they deal with markets, entrepreneurship training? But there is very, very little available outside. And so we do provide a lot of those trainings, and we do find it makes a big difference.
And is it your experience that most of it, and it's interesting that, speaking right after Karl, even in the informal sector, there's a lot of apprenticeship and on-the-job learning. How does the demand for the kind of skills training that you're providing, which is presumably self-selected, how does that manifest itself?
Well, it's very different when you talk about wage work and when you talk about the self-employed. And we find, and I want to talk about women who are self-employed. Again, just taking the example to put the picture in your mind of a small farmer or a street vendor or somebody who has a small business at home. I think one of the main things that especially if it's women, is that we provide a training in self-confidence and linking networking with the external world, which may be with the market, which may be with the suppliers of raw materials. For those who have worked for a while, this is the area where they, once they get a network, they can do their own learning. So I think this is one very important thing we provide. And secondly, the other important thing that we do provide is training for new methods. So new type of seeds, new type of water harvesting, new types of designs, access to new types of machinery. And I think those are the things for the self-employed which are really important. But the modules have to be designed very carefully, because these are people who are living near subsistence. So they can't spend days and days taking training. So it has to be short trainings with a very clear outcome at the end. At the end of this training, you will get a loan and you'll be able to buy a better sewing machine. So. Okay.
One of the other sort of points that has come up is whether different, one was the formal, informal, and the complementarity between skills and jobs. I mean, that the other sort of dimension that has come up is the age aspect. Some evidence that people at different ages, and I can vouch for that, learn differently, and therefore, being conscious as we provide training to younger versus older workers needs to perhaps be thought of as a slightly different line of business, or more purposefully differentiating. That's at least one of the contentions that is put out there. So maybe again, let me start with Mona this time and sort of ask the question: from your reviews, from your studies, do you see any evidence whether there's a significant difference in terms of how workers learn on the job between different age cohorts? What has been the experience from your reviews and studies?
So I would answer this in two ways. First is that when you look at how people learn full stop, so how adults learn, there is an emphasis on the hands-on learning practicum type, which is viewed as more as the most effective, irrespective of whether you are a youth or whether you are older. Right? And so now, though, the interesting variation comes in, okay, well, how does that practicum happen? Right? And how does it look different if you are a youth versus you are older? Youth are much more open towards using technology simulation, for example. Older workers may be more open to a physical simulation. So you actually set up a room so that it's like a call center, or you set up a room so that you have, sewing machines at each desk, or, so on the technology side, youth are much more open towards experimentation down that path. And why is that important? Because through technology, we're able to train many more workers than is the case with physical simulation or with apprenticeships. There are only so many apprenticeships that can go around. And those who apprentice often prefer to invest more deeply in youth because they see the trajectory versus willing to invest in those who are older. So I think it affects the manner and the appetite for apprenticeship much more extremely. Now, would we say that that it is the case that those who are older do not learn as much as those who are younger? I mean, frankly, we've seen cases of both. It is a function of the caliber of the apprenticeship and the instruction. So I would not uniformly say that those who are younger learn better than those who are older. What is required to learn are people who are motivated and who are dedicated and a great instructor. That's what enables learning.
Well, maybe we'll pick this thing up in terms of why can't we go to scale? And I think you threw in the point about technology to be able to leverage and grow the pool that we can interact with. Maybe we'll pick that up as we go along. Sergio, any experiences from your analysis, your study, and your experiences on the different approaches and the different level of effort and investment that that has gone into different training programs for different cohorts of ages?
So what you see in the literature is you have the distinction between these programs particularly oriented to youth. They're different, they're designed to attack some of the problems this particular cohort is facing. And what you see in the evidence basically shows you that, so if you compare, for example, the results from the US, in the US, the effects of youth programs early in the 80s and the 90s are actually not very effective, compared to Europe, in which you do find some evidence of positive effects when it comes to comprehensive and, again, very expensive programs on youth, on employment, and on wages, even long-term effects. And then when you add the evidence from Latin America or other developing countries, you find that there is some evidence of positive effect on youth, particularly on those coming from poor and disadvantaged environments. So overall, I think the evidence shows that there's, first of all, heterogeneity, but you can, in fact, change sort of the labor market prospects of youth compared to adults. Now, when it comes to learning, I mean, if you think about this, how the brain works and what we know about the development of socio-emotional skills, sure, as we age, the skills are evolving, are changing, and that's a challenge when it comes to understanding how change the way you operate and you function. But saying that it's harder for an older worker to learn compared to a youth, it's hard. I'm not actually willing to say that. I think the way of tackling these issues is with incentives. I think the way they react to incentives is different. The way they see the world is different, and in many cases we don't really understand. We don't really use that approach to model, to design the training system. I think that's essential. And in that line of along those lines, one of the key elements when it comes to the distinction between youth and older workers is probably this idea of alleviating versus remediating the lack of skills they have. And when it comes to youth, you might want to spend a lot of money and resources to increase, to alleviate, and to remediate this backpack they have with bad education, bad primary and secondary education, versus the older workers. They need something different. They probably want to do better in their jobs, and that will require a different set of skills and a different set of incentives. So I think that's where we lack actually our knowledge, how to develop, how to design, how to implement effective training programs attacking these heterogeneous causes of lack of labor market productivity.
Alleviating, remediating. Karl, you've essentially adopted a European approach in Carolina. Did you find that different groups responded to the apprenticeship program more or less successfully? I mean, the example you gave earlier was about people with high school education, but it's indeterminate, obviously, as to what cohort they represent. Did you find any differences?
I would say yes, there are differences, but we initially started it from the high school level, so with the youth. And we had the challenge in the company for the people that were already there. What are you doing for me? These were 30, 40-year-old workers. And we offered them the apprenticeship program as well. They had to go to school as well. And I would say it was more difficult to learn the skills, math, physics, and things like that. But the ones who wanted to, who made up their mind, they passed. So, of course, it's getting more difficult as we age, and we cannot keep things like that. On the other hand, the experience we had, what I think is important, that the youth has a lot of technical skills that sometimes the older workers don't have, but the older workers have other skills that the youth don't have. For example, communication, social skills that are very important. And if we are working with a mentor and a young apprentice together, we can see that the mentor can give him good examples how to communicate his skills to other people. And if there's a good environment between the workforce, it helps the companies naturally to be more efficient. And that's, I think, very often overlooked, that the seasoned workers have a lot of skills that are not tapped. And if they pass on skills to the younger people, the young people pass on their skills to the older, like I can see that in computer skills, things like that. Whereas when it comes to social skills, we see a lot of young people are not able to communicate or talk anymore because they do everything via messages, and don't see really how often they hurt people's feelings by not seeing the other side, talking face to face. And that's where the older workforce is more experienced, and they tell the younger workforce.
I think it's very interesting that you created. It sounds like you created a very different set of incentives for the older labor force that's already on board, and tapped into a slightly different value proposition, not only the technical, but some of these other skills that are important for a well-functioning workplace.
Well, there's a lot of the older workforce sometimes is threatened. They feel like they might lose their job, and we naturally guarantee them their job till they retire, so they feel very comfortable, and then they're passing on skills. Mm-hmm. If you don't do that as an employer, they keep their skills, and I think that's very often overlooked.
And it may speak to the broader issue, I think, that all of you raised about incentives and motivation. What motivates people to be able to pass on the knowledge and create incentives that go beyond the monetary and pecuniary incentive. But one thing that sort of strikes me, and Mona, maybe you can reflect on this for all of us, as you did your global study, it strikes me that there are pockets of interesting findings and interesting experiences, but I'm not convinced, at least just listening and hearing, that there is a systematic availability of data to be able to have a truly evidence-based discussion as to how to do this. There are good anecdotal examples that are quite successful, but how that then eventually translates into a systemic, as you put it, approach is probably handicapped by the availability of good comparable systemic data. What did you find when you did the review?
So let me just reaffirm one of the points you made and then speak to the data point. So as part of our research, we looked at over 100 examples of successful education to employment solutions. But these were 100 examples that we learned of, sort of through friends, network, family, etc. There is no PISA for education to employment. There is no place that you can go and actually understand these in the world are the best. We found 100, but that's not necessarily the definitive 100. And the world doesn't know where to look to really find the best. That was problem one. Problem two is that the examples that we did find, they serve hundreds of students, maybe thousands. If we're lucky, extraordinarily lucky, you find hundreds of thousands. But that's, I can count on one hand the number of examples we found like that. And certainly not the millions. So to the point of, if we're going to fix this, we need something that is systemic. We cannot have, in all of these cases, so for example, Apprenticeship 2000, it is fantastic that Karl and his colleagues created this, but it requires enlightened leadership, real investment, real motivation to be able to achieve something like this. We need solutions where it happens organically every day because the system makes it so. So part of the issue is there simply is not enough data to go around that can explain to us what are the interventions that actually work and in what context. So if we were to take Apprenticeship 2000 and go to, is that going to work? Right? If we're going to take some of your examples and go to Latin, is that going to work? We simply don't have the database to tell us that. In terms of the education to employment domain, this spans education, labor, industry. It spans vocational education, university education, work readiness programs, corporate training. It's so fragmented, and there is no one that oversees and has a bird's eye view of what's going on across the entire continuum from education to employment. We need that kind of visibility if we're going to support youth to better make the transition from education to employment. And we are seeing the creation of these kinds of bird's eye view institutions now, either at the national level, at the sector level, at a regional level in several countries because of this need. And their job is not only to create this data, but to also disseminate it to ensure that what we're learning in one part of the country goes to another.
That was a planned question for my colleagues here from the World Bank to think about the next sort of set of inquiries that we need to do. I want to sort of quickly shift gear to pick up on something that all of you said that I thought was critical, and you let us off, Mona, about how education providers, employers, and the public, as well as the individuals who wish to be employed, appear to operate in parallel universes and different galaxies. And yet that the solution set, and you said it has to be demand-driven. I mean, all of you pointed out to some level of a partnership for this to even have a chance to move forward. So let's maybe spend the next sort of 15 minutes or so to talk about that aspect. I hear this, and yet it doesn't seem to be happening, at least at the scale that would really matter to make a systemic difference as opposed to anecdotally here and there. So, I mean, one of the questions, and maybe Karl, you can lead us off on that, is in Apprentice 2000, what did it take for multiple employers to cooperate in the provision of service? How did they get around the sort of the fear that you're going to nick I've trained the staff and you're going to nick them, and I'm going to invest and the fruits are going to be borne by somebody else? That sort of prisoner's dilemma type behavior. What has been the experience, and what do you think were the factors that allowed you to actually have a cooperative process in the apprenticeship program?
Well, through Employers Association in the Charlotte area, I knew a lot of companies that had like-minded ideas or thoughts. We all had the same problem, the lack of skilled labor. And by finding or carefully selecting the companies we work with that would also invest into this long term, this is an investment a company makes, I say, between 5 and 10 years till you have really a return. We basically worked together for about 2 years and find ourselves like that. We have the same thoughts about education, about the needs in employment places. And so we have a very good cooperation, and we do not take people from each other. It's nobody has a contract; they can leave, but we have an understanding that we don't seek each other as employees naturally. And during the 4 years, the students basically get to know the companies, they get to know the values, the benefits, the treatment they have in a company, and we feel very comfortable that they stay with us. And it has been now 17 years, and typically what we found after 5 years, the retention rate is 80%. So you have to naturally pay the market rate that the people stay with you. You have to give them the benefits, etc. And for us, it has not been a problem, I have to say. Of course, most people are concerned about that, but we have very attractive employers around us like BMW, etc. And we have been able to keep our employees.
Yeah, I heard about BMW. Mona, you did this global survey. What sort of highlights do you pick up on the collaboration, cooperation, partnership between employers and public agencies? And I use that at different levels of government. And what was the experience that you found? And which one has been particularly noteworthy, perhaps?
I'd say 3 things here. The first is actually the most important access of collaboration and cooperation is between the employers and the education providers in our work, less so the employers and government. So we've seen examples where employers are literally pulling government behind them and bringing in the education providers to be able to craft, something along the lines of an Apprenticeship 2000 type solution. And so then government comes in to, possibly make the solution bigger by, providing some sort of incentive to the collaboration. We've seen examples like that. What I would further say is the most, what government has done that is most helpful to the employers really has been around the collection of data. And I keep coming back to this point, but I'll give you one example from your region, Colombia. So they have created a labor observatory that literally tracks data for 5 years post-graduation. So they can tell you after you've graduated, what was your entry wage, you then got promoted, what was your wage then, you got fired, that was sad, and then you went back to school, and it was, so they can literally track you for 5 years. And employers are kind of looking at this and saying, okay, this is interesting. And they can then now make different decisions about, which education institutions you actually want to work with. Youth and parents, by the way, can use that data very well as well in terms of plotting out what is their future. So the most important access that we've seen government play has been much more around data standards type of role. The make it happen axis of collaboration has been the employers, education providers.
Very interesting. And maybe later on I'll ask Renana first, but the Chilean experience and what's going on in the tertiary education sector right now, despite all those efforts, how does that articulation happen or not happen? But from the SEWA experience and perspective, you earlier said that you do a lot of on-the-job apprenticeship from the older, more experienced to the younger workers. What has been your experience, speaking of the evidence and the data, how do you make evidence-based choices? How do you assess the outcomes and the successes and failures so you can fine-tune the services that you provide?
I think I'd like to make a distinction between the younger workers and the older workers. And in India today, there is a real surge of young people with education. Earlier, education and literacy, school education was lower, and especially for girls, now there's a sudden surge. And parents are really, the older workers who are the parents are putting a lot of their earnings into education for their children. And the younger workers have different ambitions, different ideas about what their children should be doing. And so the work of the parents doesn't really translate into the work of the children or of the young people. So we sort of have two different, as it were, streams, where the young people who have different ambitions, we have what we call a polytechnic. Because once they leave school, or even before they leave school, because they usually are not able to finish high school, in our country there is nothing. So there is no skill training, polytechnic, vocational training, very, very little. And so then we've been providing this gap of skill training, which then goes on, which are completely different skills. So they're very, very keen to learn things like computers. Our computer classes are always double, triple booked. They're very keen to learn English because that's something that can take them, gives them personality. And they're, of course, very keen. They know the job opportunities. For example, a lot of the girls are learning beauty culture, which we didn't like to teach, but they kept saying, no, that's where the jobs are. And so they have beauty culture, self-employment. And so we suddenly find ourselves going off in a different stream for the younger people. For the older people, one of the things I think that is very important is that there's a lot of traditional skills that exist. So embroidery, for example, old ways of all kinds of artisanship, weaving, pottery, and there is actually a very large market for that. And there are not enough people who know that. So we try to deepen a lot of the traditional skills. And we find that the younger women are also now, once it becomes a little bit more modern, once the little machines come in, the younger people also are coming into that. I think I just would want to add one more example, which is that, again, for self-employment, that people tend to like going into self-employment because it gives them a lot more independence. And also in India, unless you have a very good job, the jobs pay very little. So self-employment is an area where you can make a little extra profit. So people do tend to want to go into self-employment, whether they're younger or older.
To sort of maybe round out this segment, I'll ask Sergio. Chile has been known to have done a lot of work on essentially demand-driven training programs. And yet, when we look at some of the social tensions recently with the tertiary education, there seems to be something going on where there's a mismatch. Is it a timing issue? And what are the experiences that you want to highlight what lessons do you take from the Chilean experience?
Well, that would, to give you a full answer, that would take like an hour, but let me try to. No? Yeah, exactly. So tell me, right. So in theory, if you look at the structure of the Chilean system, both when it comes to training and post-secondary education, it has all the things that we consider good practice, part of a good practice. So it's decentralized. The competition for funding is usually ferocious. The market is ruled by the private providers, and the public agencies are not really involved beyond funding. But it's still we have if you look at the evidence, for example, I have this paper looking at the effect of training on wages. There is nothing. Wages or training on employment, there is nothing. A system that costs us something like $300 million per year, it has no effect on employment, has no effect on earnings, on workers. So what's going on? And this is the same thing, sort of what's going on also in the context of these tensions that you mentioned, is information. I mean, I think the core, a building block for this system, to work is information. And you have information. In Santiago, you probably have more information on where to have a good lunch or dinner compared to what you can find, where do I have a good college or a good training provider. I think that's essential. And with the new information, using administrative data, for example, we recently computed that even the rate of return to education might be negative in some of these careers, which is, very different from what you have in mind, very different from what people think. But it's important to actually know, to tell them that this might not be the case. I mean, the idea of having an education might actually hurt if you're not careful in how you make your decisions. And let me point out two other institutional problems which I think are essential and probably applied not only to the case of Chile, but more generally. So one is the distinction between social protection and labor market productivity when it comes to training. Are you doing training because you want to, from a SP sort of perspective or from a labor market perspective? Because strictly speaking, those two problems are very different and you need different strategies. And the second one, which is sort of linked to what Karl was saying. So we tried to implement, I worked for the Chilean government for a few years ago, and we tried to implement an apprenticeship program. From a systemic perspective overall, the country. It was impossible. So who opposed the most? Workers, unions. Because once you have a new worker or this apprentice actually on the firm, well, how do you do that? It's a new contract? Are you going to be changing the law? Does that mean that it's a flexible position? This guy is going to be there for a few years. Maybe I am next. I have a long-term contract. So now you're going to be offering me an apprenticeship. You might fire me. So the link, the problems that might come from the actual legislation, the labor, in this case, the labor code, prevent us from making progress. We could not implement the apprenticeship program because the union basically opposed. It was impossible. So that's something we are not really discussing when it comes to incentives. Why are the firms are not engaging in this? Maybe it's too costly. They don't want to deal with bureaucracy. They don't want to deal with the government. I think that's a challenge, and the experience we have, I don't think is actually conclusive when it comes to understanding those challenges.
Sort of go on this particular last point that you made, but maybe. If there are a couple of questions, comments from the floor, let's take them now and then move to the last segment. So if I can see whether there's anybody who wishes to. Yes, and please identify yourself, yeah?
Thank you. This is Demanddriven from Ankara office. It's a general question, but maybe Mona can answer that. When you look at the demand from the employers, mainly the formal employers, they say that the newcomers the new recruits they have lack of skills, basic skills and technical skills. But when you see how they treat with these newcomers, either new graduates or unemployed or coming from other firms, they reformat them. Actually, they don't use most of the knowledge, experience of these people. So the formal or informal training and education programs, the governments and other institutions spend lots of money. But if these investments are just tools for the graduates or for people to just pass the recruitment stage and get into a working environment to be reformatted, do we need to reconsider these whole process and find more cost-efficient systems, or have another type of relationship between the job market, the firms, and the training and education institutions? Thank you.
Why don't you lead off, and then any of you who may want to chip in, just quickly chip in, and then I'll take one more and then move to the next segment. Yeah.
Turkey was actually one of the countries in our survey. And there's actually not very much investment of Turkish companies in training, but we can come to that later. Here's what I would say. When we talk to companies, the vast majority were essentially saying, look, we hire on capabilities and attitude, we train on skill. Why is that? Because what youth have been trained in is often either not of the appropriate caliber or insufficient relative to the job. So is there a need to reformat how we think about what education is? Absolutely, yes. And those collaborations between employers and education providers that we've seen that are most successful are essentially trying to figure out what's the 10% that you really, really, really need to know in order to be effective in a job in whatever discipline. And that's on the technical side. And then what are the soft skills that you really need to have in order to be effective in your trajectory? And they focus on those things. So it's about cutting out the 90% of, I'm going to call it dross, which is in the curriculum, but actually doesn't benefit either the youth or the employer. And frankly, doesn't benefit the education provider in terms of what they're actually delivering. So there's a much longer conversation we can have about that, but that would be my 30-second response.
Any other contributions?
The only thing I can say is the importance of the educational institution and the employer, just like you mentioned, is there's a very strong link, and I think the United States has a very good system of community colleges. They play a big role, and they have in the last, I think many community colleges in the last 15, 20 years have realized that they have a chance to complement employers. And we have, for example, a lot of collaborations. We meet at least once a month, the teachers and our trainers together. What are our needs? What do they have to teach? So that's, I think that is very essential that there's a good collaboration and without any government involvement, so to say.
One more? Any other questions? Yes, please. Say who you are.
Hi, hello. Ines Cudo from the education team in Peru. This discussion is very interesting, but in most of the countries, probably all the countries we work in, the single largest employer is the government, actually. You know? So I was wondering how this discussion plays out in this context and what the role of the government is as an employer as well, no? Teachers, health workers, justice system workers, administrators.
Okay, let me start with Sergio, and then move down. And
So I completely agree. I mean, and I think it's quite frustrating actually to see how the government sort of the administration demand performance from firms and the private sector, and they don't really take into account how badly they do in terms of training and securing the productivity of their workers. Now, what you see, it's the link between. I think there is space here to have the government improving the productivity, right, from the worker and probably from the whole nation. And I think the link between public institutions, tertiary institution, even technical high school, and the public employees is something we haven't really investigated at all. There are no connection. They don't talk to each other, and people are reluctant, to be honest, to even consider that, because it's sort of going back to school is too expensive. Remember that most of the people actually hate going to school anyway. Now you're going to put them back in the school, and that's something we have to understand how to handle. When you look at the evidence of, on-the-job training versus classroom training, probably the main issue is that when you ask them, the people participating in the classroom training, these are guys that they drop out from high school, and now you're putting them back into the same classroom with the same technology, right? The same, probably even the same teacher. And when it comes to the public sector, local level, not only the central level, but local level, something they should definitely try to investigate. How, for example, municipalities might use the resources from the technical high school, the local technical high school, to improve productivity is something we haven't even done, and it might be a significant channel to improve productivity. So I think it's a key question. I don't think we have a very good answer, to be honest.
I'm going to pass it to Renana, because I think formal sector job, that's probably true. But when we look at the informal jobs, there are probably a lot more outside. And how do we provide training and skills upgrading in that sector? So,
do you want me to answer that question? Yes. Sort of, yeah. Actually, I thought it was an excellent question, because you're absolutely right. The jobs that are there are far more in the government sector than in the private sector. And we find that our members, the younger people, not the older ones, obviously, that's their real aspiration. How do you become a school teacher in a government school? How do you become a para-nurse in the health center? And I think one of the important services is, how do you train people to be able to apply for those type of jobs, because there's tremendous competition for those jobs. And then what tends to happen is that the younger people from better off families or with better education or who have the networks and the connections get in. So I think the real challenge which we face and which we try to overcome by giving special trainings, by finding out what are the special needs of that job or the qualifications, and also creating the social networking, because I think without social networking, it's difficult to bring these people to the attention. So I think the challenge really is that how do the poorest people and how do the young women and men, boys who are of our children, children of our members, how do they get into these government jobs? And it doesn't just go up. So.
Thank you. I'm sure we could just stay on this, but given time, I'd just like to sort of move to the last segment here, which is that, and some of you already touched upon this, about the different types of skills, and whether labor market success is, how much it is determined by behavioral in addition to cognitive and technical skills. I mean, that issue came up on, I think all of you mentioned that in some form. Let me perhaps ask Mona to reflect on, from what you've seen, is it too late in such programs that you've seen to impart anything but technical skills? I mean, is there still room and space to provide some of the behavioral social skills that are necessary for a successful labor market? And then perhaps I'll ask, go back to you, Renana, and say, how do you deliver such services and such upgrading in an informal setting? No? So, Mona.
So I'd actually say that of the successful education to employment programs which we saw, they are absolutely embedding soft skills along with the technical skills. It is not an either or. And to Karl's point, if you're going to be successful in a work environment and be able to collaborate with peers, you have to have the ability to communicate clearly. You have to have the ability to work in a team. You have to have the ability to also learn. right? Because although you may be trained in a particular skill, that's not static. You have to have an inquisitive mind and be able to ask questions and be able to understand how something works. So it is absolutely not either or. In fact, when we asked employers the skill areas where they saw the biggest gap, the two that consistently came up across all 9 countries in the survey, which included both developing and developed countries, were work ethic and teamwork, consistently.
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up on this work ethic because I think that's an important one, which is that informal workers, they have been sort of in a rut, so they just know how to do the thing that they have learned for the last 30 years from their parents. And the world is changing. The people who they're working for, whether they are for an employer or a contractor or even a market or a customer, they are expecting something different. Just to give you an example, we have a lot of our members are domestic workers. They go to households and they perform a domestic service. Now, the households, the middle-class households, now have quite different needs. They do need somebody to sweep and to clean and to cook, but they also need somebody to answer the telephone and to be able to talk to visitors and to be able to look after the child. And so there's a whole different way of behaving than there was before. And what we need to do and what we do is have these small training courses about what does your customer want, what does your employer want. And we even have a little video. So how do you talk to your employer? And then we show the woman how she talks to employer and how she should be talking to her employer. And so I think how I should behave and how the world sees me is very much part of being more employable, or being better off in the market. And I think that's one area which in almost all the training programs, it's not there.
Maybe Karl, Mona said absolutely these types of skills are embedded in many of the programs that she's seen in the global survey. From your experience, first, do you find that the workers bring these kinds of skills? Are they rounded in terms of bringing not only the technical and cognitive, but also the behavioral? You had mentioned earlier that the older workers actually are beginning to provide some of the on-site support to the younger incoming workers on this area. And is your experience that then over time they're able to develop these skills further?
Yeah, I would say in general, no, they don't bring it, but they are able to still learn at that age when they're 18 years old. And it's all, I think, setting examples and leadership in a company, or if it's in the household where they come from. Certain people, they have those skills and others don't have it. But I find it very important that it's spoken out to them and clearly communicated to them. These are the expectations in the workplace. And a lot of people have these difficulties in transitioning from school into the workplace because I was just the other day listening to a program that the young people are constantly praised in schools. They do everything fantastic. They can do everything. They can be number one, whatever they want to be. And then they come into the harsh world of working environment, and there are losers sometimes. And we have to say, yes, sometimes we are not all winners, but we are trying to get better. So I would say, if you communicate clearly what the expectations are, the worth ethics is actually very good. And I don't see a difference worldwide if the people have a good education, basic education. If it's in Europe or in America, our experience is that they are the same. There's no difference in the workforce. So it starts very early on. I think in the environment they grow up what somebody has. But I think as long they're in their teens, they're still able to learn those things, and they're willing to adapt if they can see the results from the workforce, what they have achieved. So, but as it's very important to communicate the expectations, and life is different than now than it used to be in school. That's what we have learned.
One thing that we haven't explicitly spoken about here is mentoring, and whether there's a role for mentoring in the learning acquisition as well as the transmittal of some of these skills. Is there a role, and what has been the features, if there is a role, for an effective mentoring program in the transmittal and the development of these skills? Maybe I'll start with Renana in terms of the self-employed sector. Is there a role for that?
I think so, and the one thing I haven't talked about is the private sector. Everybody else was talking about that. But I think the private sector and the bigger companies have, and they're quite important in the job market. But a lot of the work that they are giving are actually outsourced work. So there is a very, at least in India, I would say about 80% of the work is not in the factory or under their direct supervision. So what we have been doing with these big companies is look at your outsourced workers, whether they're small self-employed people or they're down the chain through the contractors, say for embroidery or stitching. Is there some way that the company can work with them and transmit to them the type of work or skill that is needed at the end, or the type of product that is needed at the end? And we find that works very well. And I can't get that work ethic thing out of my mind, because one of the important things that we always have to teach our students, I call them students, but is that, if you told your customer you would deliver on so-and-so date, then you should deliver on so-and-so date. And if you cannot deliver on so-and-so date, you don't turn your mobile phone off and then don't answer. You just, you explain why it didn't. So the whole point about communications. So we find that private companies are very good at that. So if they are willing to get into a mentoring relationship, these kind of things, how to behave with the customer, how to, what is it that we require as the end product. So I think that's where the mentoring is very successful.
Any observations on the mentoring from your review?
So mentoring, absolutely critical. The key question we were looking at is how do you scale it up? Because to the earlier point, there are only so many apprenticeships, there are only so many mentors. And so we would love to give as many youth the opportunity to have this kind of a mentorship experience. So how do you do that? And so here was where, in addition to what we were discussing about technology, but actually being able to use simulation, virtual simulation, so sort of like serious games, to be able to have a almost virtual mentor, if you will, in addition to the actual physical person who is able to give you guidance. But we just have to find a way to alleviate the critical bottleneck of you must have one mentor to one apprentice. Right? Because until we do that, we're not going to be able to give youth the quantum of experience that we need.
Karl?
I would also say mentoring is a very, very important factor and has been overlooked quite tremendously. I look at it, our mothers are probably our first mentor, and then it's, in my case, the older sister as I grew up. And then comes the teens, so that's a time when we don't want to hear anything from mentors because we know it better. And but when the people go into their early 20s, we have realized they understand they need mentors and they are more accepting. And we have a mentorship program, our company, where we looked at people. We have about 400 employees, and there is probably about 20 great mentors in the company that in all levels. It's not management. It can be a warehouse worker that just knows it, and people automatically go to these people because they can pass something on to them. So we encourage in all companies to have good mentorship programs, because it's really, it helps the environment in the company, the culture, the teamwork, etc. So I think it's very important, the mentorship.
So just briefly, I think one of the a key element when it comes to mentorship is actually what happened during the last years of high school. I think the role of teachers there in generating the link right between my aspirations and expectations and the labor market I'm going to be facing is essential. And it's probably the case that many developing countries.
Welcome to Unified Conferencing. The conference is being recorded.
Either they're ahead or they're late or they're on time. So please.
And so why does this sector play work? One is that if you're getting all of the main players in the sector together, then you take away the poaching problem. Because everyone's getting, like all the employees are getting the same kind of training. So you reduce that. You also take away some of the cost resource issue, because you're now taking a single training and spreading the cost of that across multiple players. So the cost per employee now goes down. And in that way, you can also bring in small and medium enterprises into this mix, not just have it be the large companies. So that is one way that we've seen to get at scale. The other way, which I was mentioning, is about technology. So how can you use virtual simulation as a way to not completely do away with physical apprenticeship and mentorship? Because of course there are some things that you can only learn from a person, but at least on the technical side, we have now seen multiple industries that are beginning to go down this path, and that's something that could be scaled significantly. I'll just say one more thing, which I think actually, Karl, you should probably speak to. I mean, I think that the Apprenticeship 2000 experience takes a single function that is relevant to multiple sectors and is maximizing for that, which I think is another way to also scale.
Yeah. Well, we are actually promoting it in the North Carolina area. Lots of companies have come to us and look at it, and in teaching institutions, and we are promoting that they started in every city, that the companies get together. They know each other most of the time anyway, through Employers Association. And for example, there is now 3 other places, Hickory, Asheville, and Monroe. They are looking at it. The key is always that the students are within 30 miles of a public college, naturally, and the employers are in the same area. And we have forced the community colleges to teach all the classes in one day, that they only have to drive once. That's, for example, on Friday, they go to the college and they teach a curriculum that basically we required. So, and yeah, this can be in many different sectors of industries, can be applied, in my opinion. And I would say that there is more and more talk about bringing apprenticeship back in the United States now. There's been a lot of discussions about it.
And I suspect in SEWA you have from the informal self-employed perspective, there's also a possibility to, in a way, bundle it by sector or by industry segment. And
for the scaling issue, I think there is now I talk only about India, that you need far, far, far more investment into skill training. And families are willing to pay for the high school or school children. Private providers are willing to provide, but there's still a gap in what can be in the supply and the demand. So I think from the government side, as well as from the private sector, a huge amount of investment still needs to go in to start lots of decentralized training programs within villages and within inner city areas. And I think without that, we really will not get the spread of skills.
Yes. So I just want to add a macro, from a macro perspective. I agree with what you have discussed. But from a micro perspective, I think a key issue is how to have the government engage when it comes to scaling these things up. And I think a critical dimension is how to have, for example, the labor minister talking to the people in education. I think the visions they have are so different, they're so apart, that prevent the movements of improving skills and the link between a labor market and schools and so on from actually happening. I think that's a key element that we have to address. And the best programs, actually, if you go back in the U.S., JTBA, Job Corps, and things like that, are somehow connecting labor market with the schooling system. Community college, for example, and that's something developing countries are not very good at, and they need some help, I think, and guidance. So. Okay.
Unfortunately, I'm going to probably have to close this out because we're running a little late. But first of all, I mean, what I'm struck with is, as being not a specialist in this area, is how there were intersections of common themes that came, whether from the self-employed, from the formal, but all of you, I think, pointed out to this gap, which is that service providers in educational services, employers in particular, but public policy, live in parallel universes. I mean, I think that is one of the striking things, given the importance of the demand. And finding ways to connect these purposefully is clearly something important. Second, I thought you made the point that data and evidence is far too fragmented, and we need a bird's eye view to make sure that we can direct, not direct through knowledge, direct through evidence as to what works and what doesn't work, so we can invest in the right areas. I mean, I think the importance of having a demand-driven, so that the incentives and motivations are going in the direction that actually links to the labor market much more effectively. So I thought there's a lot of I sort of sense that we're at a transition point here from the old systems that we've had, which have proven to have limitations, toward one that is still evolving, but we need to start collecting the information to have it much more informed. And I'm actually very encouraged that models, whether in Germany or in your report you had Korea, there are experiences that actually do work and can be adapted to very, very different countries or industry segments. I think that is certainly a very, very positive line. And finally, I thought, on the long, big debate, skills versus jobs, the informal sector jobs first, but in general, we need to find out which ones are the common skills and which ones are the technical skills, and how do we build and provide those both as the demand of the employer needs it. So I thought there was a lot of commonality, even though we've got very, very different perspectives. So let me thank all of our panel members. Give them, please, a round of applause, and thank you, all of you. I also want to thank the organizers who put this panel together, and close by thanking all of you for being here, and express my appreciation as a consumer, as Vice President for Latin America. We are users of all this information, and we look forward to growing this segment of our business. Thank you.